Just on indulgence, Madam Speaker, I just would like to begin by thanking you and everybody here at the Robert Menzies Institute for organising such a magnificent opening event. Just the intellectual standard, diversity of thought, which I think has been terrific. It's not sometimes what you expect to find on a university campus, but it's good to see anyway. And just to see this thing come to fruition. I was first in this room, I suppose, about 5 years ago when we were in the early stages of talking to Melbourne University about incorporating the Robert Menzies Institute as part of the renovations of the quad. It was quite different then. There were 3 buildings. This was divided up in 3 parts, and there were 3 floors for the building. They put an extra one in, I think in the 1960s, not very well, and part of the renovations was to restore it to this original condition. And to me, it's a sort of goosebumps moment, because this is the room in which, when it was an original law library in which Robert Menzies would have studied a little over a century ago. His career began here in a sense that he discovered his passion for public life as a student here. And of course, his public life ended here more than half a century later as Chancellor. So it's a real thrill to be here. And thanks to the board of the Institute, thanks of course to the Vice Chancellor, Duncan Maskell, and his predecessor, Glyn Davis, who was such a good sporter, and of course the Chancellor, Alan Meyer, who's been a great supporter of this project. But it's good to see it eventually underway, and we can get down to the business of the Robert Menzies Institute now, which is really to not just talk about the legacy of Menzies as a historical exhibit or a historical study, but the philosophy behind it, as David began, I think, so aptly today, pointing out that what is yet to be fully explored, although David does it magnificently in his 4, soon to be 5-volume work on Australian liberalism, the ideas and the fact that ideas matter. So it's with that in mind that I come to look at the Forgotten People speech and the Forgotten People and their successors, and Menzies' influence on everything I think that's happened in Australia since. That his legacy is still embedded in our DNA and the way we conduct our affairs. And the country is vastly different, I will put to you, than it would have been without him. He was a consequential figure, consequential because of his ideas. It's very much, excuse me, Zach, this is an early draft of the wonderful chapter I intend to present to you, but part of the benefit here of these sort of events, of course, is we can get feedback and things I perhaps haven't got right or need to go back and look at. I welcome your suggestions. So back to Robert Menzies, and in his final year at Wesley College, his flair for language was recognised with a prize for original poetry on the subject of heritage and heroism. He was presented with a 1906 edition of the works of Alfred Lord Tennyson, which now sits just across the road in the Robert Menzies collection in the Baillieu Library. It's inscribed, "To Robert Menzies with best wishes for a successful career." I think that sort of came off, and it's dated June the 3rd, 1913. In the margin adjacent to the closing lines of the poem Ulysses, "To strive, to seek, to find and not to yield," Menzies has put a pencil jotting a reference to Captain Scott. News of the death of Captain Robert Scott Faulkner finally hit Australia in February 1913, almost a year after his death, as he was after his team had reached the South Pole and then perished in a blizzard. His heroic endeavour became a sort of metaphor, an exemplar for the times of personal endeavour and grit and strong moral character. Almost 3 decades later, as Australia was fighting for its survival in the Pacific War, Tennyson's spirited exhortation reappeared without attribution probably because it didn't need it at that time, people would have recognised it, towards the end of a radio talk some 30 minutes long that was broadcast live from the studios of 2U in Sydney and relayed to the station's affiliates in Melbourne and Brisbane. Menzies' Forgotten People radio talk was delivered on Friday, May the 2nd, 1942 at 9:15 p.m. as Australia faced the most dangerous moment in its history. 3 months earlier, an estimated 243 people had perished in the attack on Darwin. 2 weeks after the radio talk, Japanese submarines would be entering Sydney Harbour and firing torpedoes at ships at anchor. But the appeal for steadfast determination, for which Menzies evokes the words of Tennyson, is not in relation to, it's not a rallying cry to war. It's instead something he evokes as he talks about his post-war manifesto, in which enterprise and moral endeavour would be the key to prosperity. The 38 essays that comprise the Forgotten People radio talk were broadcast between May 1942 and November to an appreciative audience, quite a large audience. They asserted the principles of Australian liberalism: individual freedom, equal dignity, parity of opportunity, personal and community responsibility, the rule of law, constitutional parliamentary governance, economic prosperity, and progress that would be driven by private enterprise, motivated by reward for effort. Together, the talks form a succinct summary of the political philosophy that shaped post-war Australia and remains, as I say, the default position for political debate to this day. Of the many articulate defences for classical liberalism in the English language in the latter half of the 20th century, few spoke more potently or directly to the lives of ordinary people than Menzies. The successful application of the philosophy outlined in the Forgotten People series set the terms for Menzies' 7 terms in government and his testimony to the power of ideas. The year 1942 is a significant one in Australian history, arguably the most significant, as Dr. Brendan Nelson, the former director of the War Memorial, has observed. It was the year of the pivotal naval battle or battles in the Pacific that decided the course of the war and protected Australia's sovereign territory. It was the year through that defence of the Pacific that we forged our alliance with the United States, later to be formalised in the ANZUS Treaty. But it was significant too in the drawing of the battle lines of ideas, between competing ideas about the nation-building path that Australia would follow after the war. It would take another 7 years and 2 federal elections to decide the victor in that contest, the 1949 election. But there were 2 seminal contributions in 1942 that laid the intellectual groundwork for the debate that was to follow. Both contributions attempted to chart a course to a prosperous and more just future once the war had been won. But the means to achieve that end were diametrically opposed. The first was Menzies' Forgotten People, republished as a booklet by Melbourne publisher Robertson and Mullins soon after it was delivered, and therefore getting quite wide circulation, even before it was republished a year later in 1943 in the collected edition of all 38 radio talks given by Menzies. A series encompassed a range of topics: inflation, censorship, freedom, the alliance with the US, the nature of democracy, and the drink problem, something I think has still not been resolved, incidentally. But all of the speeches elaborated on this consistent philosophical argument that individualism was more effective and a more human way to organise our society than collectivism. The second contribution to that debate was the Beverage Report, which was published in London on December the 1st and was soon circulating in Australia. Indeed, there was much pre-publicity. The discussion of the contents was was much looked forward to in the Australian context. It had been commissioned by a Labor minister in the coalition, the wartime coalition that Churchill assembled, Arthur Greenwood. And he'd simply asked Beveridge to go away and conduct a survey of existing national schemes of social insurance and make recommendations as to how they might be improved. But Beveridge, in a classic example of Mission Creek, went a good deal further. He took it upon himself to, perhaps with the encouragement of some of the Labor members of that Churchill coalition, to expand his brief, to deliver a comprehensive blueprint for overcoming the 5 giant evils of idleness, ignorance, disease, squalor and want. And he'd do so by the construction of a massive edifice known as the welfare state. Beveridge's flair for self-publicity meant that it had wide reach, and it had a modern technocratic tone to it that made everything else that went before sound old-fashioned. In substance, however, it was predicated on a familiar utopian vision for a more equal, less competitive society in which the state assumed responsibility for the allocation of capital and scarce resources and would iron out the supposed defects of capitalism by pooling risk. The notion that science could be conscripted to design a better society gained currency amongst a generation who experienced the shock of the Great Depression and were now engaged in a total war in which individual liberties were necessarily surrendered in favour of a large shared cause. State organisation in the pursuit of victory in war was proving successful, and it engendered confidence that they could use the same technocratic expertise to plan a better future after the war. Beverage Report became a bestseller within a week of being released, and the press newspaper reports in Britain were soon referring to the Beverage Report simply as the plan, with a capital P. He had rock star status. And his report was becoming synonymous for a sort of modern technocratic way forward, which was broadly assumed amongst the intelligentsia to be a better way. Menzies' manifesto for post-war Australia, however, encapsulated in the Forgotten People speech, could not rightly be described as a plan at all. It was more accurately an application of classical liberal philosophy, in essence, to the moral and political challenges of its day. It held that nation building would be best accomplished not by technocrats, by central planners, but by empowering free individuals to pursue their own ends, to take risks. But the emphasis in Forgotten People is principally moral rather than economic. I think in recent decades, perhaps after Milton Friedman and others, we've come to think of liberalism in Australia and the rest of the world as having essentially an economic purpose to clear up the debt and deficit left by Labor parties and to get on and run the country efficiently. But there's very little economics in Menzies' Forgotten People. It's a moral tract, principally, an assertion of the equal worth of every individual. And his principal criticism of planned societies is not an economic one. That would come later, and it would become much clearer after the publication of Hayek's The Road to Serfdom in 1944. Again, Menzies' copy is in the library across the road and heavily underlined, and I'm dying for the COVID restrictions to get lifted so that I can get in, have a look at what he has actually underlined. But Menzies' criticism was simply that totalitarian or autocratic societies, first of all, did not respect human dignity, and secondly, that they simply don't work. They were less efficient at meeting human needs, although he doesn't go into the details of why. The text of the Forgotten People speech has got a real literary quality to it. In fact, I probably read it, I don't know, I've lost count of the number of times, no doubt Judith has too. And every time you return to it, it rewards you with new insights. It's just that kind of text. It has allusions to poetry of Robert Burns, as I mentioned, Tennyson, as I mentioned, and Robert Burns and Richard Lovelace, as well as Tennyson, together with allusions to the classics and the Bible. it portrays Menzies' heritage in his rich of a Presbyterian father and a Methodist mother that David spoke of earlier. It was a text for a man for whom the Christian faith was the natural and unself-conscious organising principle for both family and community. He writes that he speaks that we are all, as human souls of like value, cannot be denied, that each of us should have his chance, is and must be the great objective of political and social policy. Menzies qualifies his statement, however, to reject the idea of equality of outcomes and also acknowledges that one's chance in life can be restricted by the lottery of birth, but beyond that, it's up to every individual to take whatever talents he may have and make the best of them. Menzies says, to say that the industrious and intelligent son of a self-sacrificing and saving and forward-looking parents has the same social deserts and even material needs the dull offspring of a stupid and improvident parents is absurd. I think we'd all agree with that. The greatest lottery you win in life is to pick good parents. Indeed, said Menzies, of course, the existence of inequality is itself evidence of a dynamic society. Frugal people who strive for and obtain the margin above these materially necessary things are the whole foundation of a really active and developing life. So he's set himself up in clear opposition to the aims of the Beverage Report and the aims of the socialists more generally to produce a more equal society of more equal outcomes. Menzies, of course, calls for a lighter touch from government and a free economy, and writes about the unintended consequences and perverse influence of regulation and taxes. He speaks about the illogicality, for instance, of taxing income from personal savings as if it possessed a somewhat discreditable character. The effect of penalising self-provision in retirement was to push people towards universal pensions and social welfare programs. It was to Menzies to discourage or penalise thrift is to encourage dependence on the state. Crucially, I think in Menzies' speech, he foreshadows the post-war reforms to housing policy and education, but principally housing. Indeed, the open section of his speech is given over to a lyrical description of home life. It emphasises the social, economic, and indeed moral value of home ownership. He speaks of the home as the foundation of sanity and sobriety, which determines the health of society as a whole. The act of saving for one's own home, he says, is a concrete expression of the habits of frugality and saving, which he considered so virtuous. Your advanced socialist may rave against private property even while he acquires it, but one of the best instincts in us is that which induces us to have one little piece of earth with a house and garden which is ours. If it seems a little bit overdone to modern ears, it's probably because the contest that he was fighting has been won. But he does emphasise it quite a lot. Indeed, the word home, these were quite popular a few years ago. They've fallen out of fashion, this idea of a word map. This is the frequency of words in the Forgotten People speech represented in size. You'll see homes is large, home is separate, so singular. Put the two together and they become the second most common noun in the entire speech. 21 times in the speech he mentions either home or homes, and then he adds the word house for good effect on 3 occasions. It was delivered, of course, against the background of a tightening housing market, exacerbated by wartime shortage of labour and building materials, a shortage that would become acute by the end of the decade, by 1949, when Menzies fought the election at which he was finally victorious. There was also a lot of social concern around about the quality of housing stock and the provision of basic amenities. There was a lot of talk about demolishing slums in the inner city. Ironically, those same slums now change hands for a lot of money to the sons and daughters of the same people that were arguing they should be demolished after the war. Labour was very slow, incidentally, at a federal level to respond to the housing issue. I believe David may fill me in on this, but I note that in the 1943 election speech, it was not featured by Curtin. It did not feature heavily. And in the 1946 election address, the keynote election address by Ben Chifley, he didn't mention it once. Menzies, however, in his 46 address and in 49, made it a big part of his speech. Labour, I think, perhaps considered it to be a state matter, as indeed it was, but Menzies recognised that the Commonwealth government, through the grants and provisions it would offer the states, could actually have quite an influence. By 49, when Chifley catches up and starts talking about housing, it's very much in terms of large housing schemes, many of which would be social housing projects, some of which would be private housing, but even that private housing would be in a planned and manner dedicated by the state. It wasn't simply a case of picking a quadrate block and building your own home. But Menzies pledged to amend the Commonwealth States Housing Agreement, quote, so to permit and aid little capitalists to own their own homes. I rather like that. Now, the effect of Menzies' policies over the next 16 years is there on the record. Home ownership in Australia went from 50% to 70% in just 16 years. And it led to the growth of the suburbia that so enraged the intelligentsia, people like Ronald Boyd and Donald Horne in the 1960s, and inspired the creation of Australia's greatest comic figure, Dame Edna Everage. Everage, of course, being an Australian pronunciation of the word average, Dame Edna Everage, who lived down the road here in Moonee Ponds. I was thinking of entitling this speech, by the way, Everage versus Beverage, but I'll save that for the later incarnation, because Dame Edna, for all her sort of comic genius, does in many ways epitomise the sort of suburbia that Menzies created, a woman who's above her station. She feels she deserves better, but then ordinary people could feel that in the 60s because they had their own house, they had their own car, much to the irritation of many on the left who still believed in the great communist ideals and believed that these things like cars and homes were there to pamper the working class so they wouldn't revolt. But that was what Menzies created. The Forgotten People, well, I'm running out of time, Georgine, tell me how long I've got. Then I'll skip you, I'll skip on to the, I'll come to the, by all means. So the influence of these policies as we judge them nearly 80 years after that Forgotten People speech is profound. It set the tone for post-war Labour as well as Liberal governments. I think that the economic deregulation of the Hawke and Keating administrations and indeed the superannuation policy they introduced was at least Menzies would have recognised and approved of the intent, if not the actual shape of those policies. And they recognised, of course, in the superannuation, the value of personal savings. Well, if you wanted to do a counterfactual history of Australia without Menzies, it's always hard, of course. This country was unique in its geography and demographics and its abundance of natural resources. But let's imagine roughly what Australia would now be like if we'd taken the same course as Britain, for instance, which followed the Beveridge Pram more or less to the letter for 34 years, from the election of the Clement Attlee government in 45 to the defeat of Callaghan in 79. Would the nation be more or less prosperous? And would that prosperity be more even distributed or less? Well, for some evidence on that, I'll just close quickly with the latest Credit Suisse report on global wealth, which compares nations on these questions. Australia's got the 4th highest amount of personal wealth per capita, wonderful thing. But the influence of Menzies' policy is more observable in the distribution of that wealth. So we rank behind Switzerland, United States and Hong Kong on mean wealth as a measure, but median wealth, of course, which more accurately says what people in the middle are worth rather than the extremes of wealth and poverty at the other end, Australia comes top in terms of median wealth. And measured by the Gini coefficient, we're relatively low. Income is relatively redistributed by world standards. In the United States, 31% of wealth is held by 1% of the population. In Sweden, that great exemplar of the equal society, 35% of wealth is held by 1% of the population. In Australia, just 19.4%, which is very, very low by world standards. So my argument is that, and the nature of that wealth very quickly, 60% of Australian household wealth or personal wealth is tied into property, only 40% in equities, which would be your superannuation. And the housing element of that, the property element, is more equally distributed. So my thesis is that the benefits in terms of prosperity and the spread of that prosperity of Menzies' policy of focusing and empowering the forgotten people is manifest and real and is there in the data. And as we say at the Menzies Research Centre, in God we trust, everybody else bring data. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. I was reflecting on the Sweden numbers, that 1% of people who own 35% of wealth. I assume they're the IKEA people. All those flat packs they sell. Nick, thank you. And we are very short for time because I know those of you who are coming to the gala dinner tonight, you want to go and frock up. It has been an incredible day, but Menzies' Forgotten People broadcast, which others have said today didn't get a huge run at the time. They weren't even called the Forgotten People broadcasts by The Age, I think one of the presenters mentioned. But was that just a creation of Menzies, or was he drawing on other models from overseas? I mean, was it President Eisenhower had his fireside chats, Roosevelt, apologies, thank you, had his fireside chats and talked about liberty. Was Menzies copying a pretty good model, or was it all his own idea?
Yeah, he was. I mean, he was an innovator when it came to media, and was an early what do we call them, early adopter to the power of radio. Roosevelt's fireside chats being the model for the Forgotten People speech. I think Judith will probably clarify that, but that's as I understand it. Interestingly, too, I think on a more sort of uncomfortable note, Menzies was mindful of the power of radio as it was used by Adolf Hitler, interestingly. But he was certainly a pioneer of it as a means for doing what people like John Howard did later through talkback radio, speaking directly to people. And although the audience is not registered, my thinking is that it was a large audience, and I base that on the fact that 2UE advertised it with a big banner advert in the paper that morning, and kept going for the rest of the year, which they wouldn't do in what was a prime time slot. And there were letters to the newspaper and big discussion about that Forgotten People speech for several weeks after.
Thank you. We do have a question from online, Jack.
I'm not sure if it's a statement or a question, but it's regarding Nick's discussion of housing. Menzies was asked by an interjector at an election meeting, what are you going to do about housing without the H? And Menzies replied, put a H in front of it.
Judy.
I was just going to ask Nick if he could comment on the balance between positive and negative liberty in Menzies' understanding of freedom, freedom from and freedom to. And I've always found the comment about the dull offspring of the improvident parents actually really troubling, because the poor old dull offspring, it's not their fault what their parents did. You know, and there's a few other, there's something, and there's another one where he talks about the scum also rising. you know, and I found them really jarring notes. So I'd be interested in your comment on the freedom from and freedom to, because you seem to really be emphasising the freedom from restrictions rather than the enabling freedoms that allow people to do things and develop. So I'd be interested in your comments.
Very good point. And the language, you're right about the language. I mean, if you were his press secretary, you'd be sort of wincing. You know, lifters, not leaners, of course. I mean, I think it, in one sense, is a very, you know exactly what he means. But when Joe Hockey, you know, used that phrase in 2014, it became a problem for him. So yes, his language is rough. But look, I think Menzies, has been proven right. I mean, the fact is that you know, all the efforts we've done to try and improve educational outcomes for people from social disadvantaged backgrounds, we put a lot of money into it, and yet that's still there. So you know, to me, it was a harsh statement of reality. But I don't think it does away from the fact that he's not writing people off. He's not calling people in classes and saying, well, you're hopeless. I mean, everybody can take what they've got. And that's where it comes, I think, to your second point about freedoms. The freedom to, you know, the sort of the permissive society, as I like to call it. You know, the permissive society, as Menzies would have imagined it, a society in which you don't actually have to ask permission to do things. You can just get up there and do things. And that's, it's not the society we're living here in Victoria right at the moment.
I'm afraid we might leave it there, Nick. But thank you so much. That was fantastic.